The broom hit the floorboard with a sound Mara had learned to treat like punctuation. Small, final, tidy. And for a beat, she let herself stand in the hush that followed. The clubhouse smelled of motor oil and old smoke, of sweat that had dried like history into the seams of leather chairs. With the single window at the back streaked gray by winter, light came in as a rumor, and Mara moved through the room the way someone moves through a house they mean not to wake. Careful, deliberate, as if each sweep might be the last small order her hands could impose on a world that had recently gone wrong. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He watched her in the dark the way a wolf studies a deer through brush. Not hungry exactly, but precise, cataloging. Roman Knox Cade had stood in the shadow doorway since before dawn, sleeves rolled over knotted forearms, a cigarette unlit between two fingers because habit was sometimes a substitute for thought. The club's neon sign outside still hummed, painting his jaw the color of cheap chrome. The rest of him, the shoulders, the scar that cut like a comma through his left eyebrow, fell away into the dim. He had not planned to come in this cold. He had not planned to find a woman sweeping the floor of his clubhouse. Mara was not supposed to be here. The cleaner he hired had called out. He had come down to check the locks, tied up the noise of a restless chapter, and find order. Instead, he found motion. Her back to him, hair twisted into a loose knot at the nape of her neck, a knit hat tucked in the crook of her elbow. She moved with an economy that felt like defiance. The way she polished chrome with a rag that smelled faintly of lemon reminded him of something he could not name, and then, dangerously, of something he had once loved and killed with his indifference. He had seen women come and go in this room, each carrying the history of the club in different clothes. The wives, the old girlfriends, the girls who worked in bars and thought they understood the code because they had learned to laugh when men shouted. Mara did not wear the club. She wore a stained work jacket and a face that did not ask for permission to be ordinary. Knox felt a current in him that had nothing to do with the club's ledger, nothing to do with rules. He felt the muscles in his chest tighten as if some small part of him remembered tenderness like a bruise. She wiped the edge of a table and paused, listening. She thought for a moment it was the hum of the neon, or a mouse perhaps, the little domestic sounds her grief had wound her to notice. She kept her head down because the world had taught her to. Down was safer, anonymity a shield. Mara's fingers were blunt from dish soap and labor, knuckles pale against the leather earmarks of the chairs. She had taken the job because it gave her space. It bought a thread of newness around a life that had been stripped to marrow by loss. Her apartment smelled like winter and cigarette smoke, and every night she pinned the curtains closed to keep the city from remembering her. Here, in the cavernous club, she convinced herself she could move like a ghost between relics of rebellion without being named. "You're late," Knox said, before he knew why he had to say anything. The sound of his voice cut across the room. It was not loud, but it made the floorboard tremor, as if a bike had just rolled in. Mara stiffened, fingers gripping the rag as if it were the last thing to steady her. She turned. The light caught her eyes and made them a hard, stormy brown. "No one said I was." Her voice folded into an attempt at politeness that had been taught by working with strangers, by smiling to keep things from getting mean. She had learned to make herself small in rooms where names carried weight. Knox studied her face like a ledger, line by line, and because the club name meant something, because a president's presence was a kind of law, the men who would be waking soon expected that their house had been accounted for. "I didn't know you'd be working today," he said. Simple. He could have ended the conversation there and left her alone, but he did not. "Name?" "Mara," she said. Last name in the city was Rios, but she kept that thin as a secret and did not hand it over before he asked. She had practiced the omission. Knox noticed, and the air changed. A man who is used to being obeyed reads what is withheld like a map. He saw the small vertical scar on her wrist and the way her thumb dragged over it when she smiled, absent the smile that meant she was not empty. "Don't let anyone else in," Knox said, and it was neither request nor order, it was an ownership of the moment. He stepped forward across the floor to run a hand along the rim of the bar, feeling the patina left by years of heavy elbows and heavier decisions. Mara watched him like one watches a storm just before it breaks, fascination braided with an instinct to hide. Her chest was a tight place. Her grief was not the kind the city could see. It was private, the kind that lives in the spaces between breaths. 2 months ago, she had stood by a window as they took him, the only family she had left, wrapped in a small, cheap flag she had ironed once in college. She scrubbed her hands until they hurt. Cleaning the clubhouse had been a practical sorcery. Keeping the motion of her hands in service to other people's mess kept her from disassembling herself in the nights. Knox watched the rhythm of her hands, and in that watching, he felt the first, impossible fissure in his conviction that he should be indifferent. He had devoted himself to the club from the time he was a child with no other hands on him. He owed his survival to places like this and to rules that ran like veins through his life. But people like Mara bent the rules like light through glass. They revealed edges he had long learned not to notice. He also knew that looking was a claim, and in the club's economy, claims could not be neutral. "You work for Coleman?" he asked, naming the man who paid the cleaner. Names in the clubhouse were currency. To ask was to test whether she was a known entity or something new. Mara blinked. That was the name she'd been told to use. "Coleman sent me," she said. "Part-time. She hesitated, and then, because the truth felt like a rope that could snap under the weight of other lives, she said, "I need hours." Knox considered the answer. He could feel the old, easy suspicion rising in his chest. Cleanliness hiring was often code for girlfriends, for women who were in for more than mop duty. He did not like surprises. He did not like loose threads. The club had rules about loose threads. Tie them off, cut them, toss them in the yard to dry. He also heard the fragility in her voice, and some scarred part of him, one that had learned to keep a child alive in a world that did not, softened. "Don't take anything," he said. Not a command to her, but a rule stamped into the floorboards. Things had gone wrong in the past. Things stolen, things sold, things spoken. The club's trust was a narrow bridge built out of blood and time. Mara nodded, because she had learned long ago that no argument with a man like him would help. "Finish up," he added. "I'll check the bikes. Lord knows the night got colder." It was an excuse he used to keep his patrols tidy and to watch the chapter sleep. Tonight, the patrol was a deliberate distance designed to keep from saying more than needed. She worked in silence, and he left her with that. But when he walked back down the hall later to lamp the back room, he found her at the pinboard, her fingers pausing over a cluster of old photographs. The men whose faces the club worshipped like saints and martyrs, captured in cigarette smoke and bad light. One photograph was of a man with Mara's jaw, the same stubborn tilt of a mouth. He said nothing. He had no right. "Those are the men who rode hard," he murmured, not meaning to be brusque. "You shouldn't be handling them like they're old postcards." Mara's hand hovered over the picture as if it were a wound. "They're just faces," she said. Her breath came shallow. "People have memories. They're not mine to do with as I please." The lie lived on the surface of her words like oil. Knox's silence was a low percussion. In it, Mara heard the unasked questions about the name she kept close. She thought, absurdly, that if she scrubbed the chrome enough, the past would not find purchase. She looked at him and saw a man who wore the club's history like a second skin, scarred, protective, utterly dangerous. The space between them was no longer neutral air. It was an arena where small boundaries were being redrawn. He decided to leave her to her work, but as he stepped out onto the porch to light the cigarette he had not yet struck, he felt the shape of a new problem settling into his jaw. A woman in the clubhouse who did not belong to anyone. A name not offered. A past glanced at and folded away. Knox knew the city like an atlas of grudges. He knew the map of clubs, of lines drawn and erased with the tired repetition of men who had been hurt into stubbornness. If Mara bore a name he had been taught to hate, if the blood under her skin whispered his club's enemies, then she would not simply be a problem for her. She would be his problem. Mara felt the weight of his look and the pull of something like dread. She had come here to hide from the world. Instead, she had stepped into the eye of something that could see her. Her hands, blunt and steady, kept moving, polishing chrome that reflected a man whose whole life revolved around defining enemies and family with the same heavy hand. She told herself she could be small, unremarkable, but Knox's presence made that promise a dangerous thing. When the first of the Prospect crew came in, fresh from their run to a diner on the far side of town, their laughter ricocheted off the walls and the hush broke. Mara smoothed her skirt down on instinct. The men looked at her like one looks at a favor to be negotiated. Knox watched them watch her and felt the club's gears start to turn. Curiosity, approval, the measuring stick of value. He stepped forward then, and it was not authority alone that carried him. It was the first real, expensive decision he had made since the day he signed the patch. "She's working," he said, simple and iron. It set a line others could respect. The chapter's eyes slowed and tracked back to him. In that motion, Mara became an object of the club's gaze, examined, rated, consigned by proximity. The men muttered affirmations. The prospect, who thought himself witty, offered a smirk. Mara met it with an evenness that did not invite debate. She was not as anonymous as she had hoped. Presence had a price, and tonight Knox had written the first installment. As the morning light turned the neon to a memory, Mara felt the beginnings of a dilemma that would not let her breathe easy. To remain invisible, she would have to cede herself to the watchful rules of men who owned loyalty like a breed. But to hide her surname, her origin, meant that each day she worked could be a tinderbox. Knox had claimed a perimeter without asking. Mara realized she might have to decide whether to live inside the safety of that perimeter or to keep running toward a life that did not belong to any man. She held the broom like a compass and tried not to look at him, but in the corner of her vision, Knox was a silhouette that insisted on being read. His presence promised protection that could be both sanctuary and prison. She had been taught to mistrust gifts until proven harmless. Knox, for his part, had begun to recognize the dangerous allure of a woman who did not belong, and that recognition was the first brittle crack of something that would either save them both or break them on the rocks of their shared world. The laughter in the clubhouse folded into a low thunder, the kind that presses against your ribs and makes you want to move away from its center. Mara worked as if she could will the sound into shape with the broom, guiding it, directing it, keeping it from splintering into something dangerous. She told herself the men were merely men, predictable in their hunger for novelty and attention. She told herself Knox's claim had been small and practical, because claiming, for him, was a matter of maintaining order. But every time a hand reached for a beer or a joke grazed the name of someone they'd lost, she felt exposed, as if the room might inventory her like one more relic. Knox noticed the little ways the chapter tested her. A prospect nudged his friend and said something loud enough to scrape across the varnished bar. Another, casual, what she did when the job ended. They were looking for a thread to pull. The probing wasn't cruel yet, curiosity more than anything. But in the clubhouse, curiosity was currency that could buy loyalty or sow suspicion. Knox watched their faces for shifts and found none, so he let the question sit unanswered. He measured his restraint like a debt he might have to repay. Between sets of work, Mara let herself breathe through the rhythm of sweeping, counting out the minutes until she could return to the anonymity of the bus route and the small, neat apartment that smelled of lemon cleaner and grief. She would not lie. There was a tremor in her chest each time Knox entered the room. The attention pricked like a sting. She had learned long ago that being noticed issued obligations you didn't ask for. Yet there was also the quiet kind of attentiveness he showed when he passed the photos on the pinboard and did not demand explanations. It made something in her uncoil like a release valve being eased. "You from around here?" a voice asked. It was Jonah, a short-haired prospect whose eagerness sat like a hungry animal under his skin. He had the look of a man who loved to place himself inside other people's stories. "No," Mara said. Her answer was a damped stone dropped into conversation, sinking, muting. She kept her eyes on the floor, as if the lines in the wood might map a safe route out of a dangerous moment. Knox stepped closer to the bar and set his palm on the cool wood, not touching Mara, but making sure she felt the silhouette of protection. It was a message the men understood. You don't take liberties here. Jonah's smile thinned. He nodded, meant to be graceless, but kept his edge. In Knox's world, threats were seldom direct. They were tests folded into kindness. He could be cruel if it kept his chapter secure, but there was a different cruelty that had hollowed him, the slow erosion of his own better impulses when the club demanded hardness. Mara heard Jonah's footsteps fade as the group moved to the back porch to smoke and talk about routes and risks. The murmured conversation over the hum of the heating was the lifeblood of the chapter. Plans, petty boasts, warnings passed like cigarettes. She finished the duty at the bar with a deliberate thoroughness, wiping fingerprints until the wood shone like water. Cleaning had always been a sacrament for her, a small ritual against chaos. It kept her hands honest and her mind tied to the present. Knox watched her return the mop bucket to the storeroom. That small domestic chore, a simple, low-placed task, softened something in him, a muscle that had learned to brace for blows. He did not want this to mean anything beyond simple human decency. He did not want to start counting minutes against a clock of consequences. But kindness in a room like this read like faction. It required explanation. It required risk. "You okay?" he asked, blunt and unnecessarily personal. He hadn't meant to say it. When the sound of his voice landed against her like a question, Mara nearly dropped the mop. She looked at him then, not with the practiced understatement she used for strangers, but with a rawness that surprised them both. "Is anyone okay?" she asked, and the question cut through the space between them like wind. Knox's jaw tightened. His first instinct was to deflect with routine, check the bikes, call a meeting, run a ledger. Instead, he found himself answering honestly. "We survive. Mostly." He meant it as a literal statement. He also meant it the way men of this life often mean to confess where words for feelings don't exist. He had no language for sorrow that didn't run along the grain of duty. Mara folded both hands over the mop handle as if it were a talisman. "Survive doesn't always feel like living," she said. There was no flinching in her tone, just a tired clarity. The mop creaked as she shifted weight. The sound was intimate in a room that rarely heard domestic objects complain. The honesty between them tightened like a wire. Knox wanted to step closer and offer something, an invitation to be part of a thing that was larger than the neatness of a mop or the relentlessness of her loss. But he knew what being part of the club demanded: allegiance, a willingness to accept the rules of belonging. He saw how the men watched her, how they cataloged her responses for signs of weakness or advantage. He didn't want her to be anyone's prize. He didn't want his desire to protect to be the very thing that made her captive. "There's a meeting tonight," he said carefully, keeping his voice practiced for the room. "Council. No women. Mara's chest tightened at the exclusion. The building had rules that wrapped around like chain. She felt their weight, small and immediate. "I won't be there," she said, sharper than she intended. The word came with a fossilized anger at being excluded that lived beneath all the surfaces of her life. Knox studied the seam of her mouth and the way her thumb worried at a frayed thread on her jacket. For a moment, he imagined telling her about the night his father had left him at a bus stop with a duffel bag and instructions about not getting soft. He imagined telling her about the cost of softness in a world that rewarded hardness. But then the Prospect Boys laughed too loudly in the hall, and Knox folded the image away. He was not ready to admit softness to himself, let alone to someone who could be a liability. "Don't let me keep you from your work," he said, but the tone was a betrayal. He wanted to mean it, but the way his shoulders sloped when he turned away betrayed his reluctance. He was making space for the club to remain the club while creating an invisible margin of care that he had not sanctioned. The sanction felt like trespass. The morning moved toward noon, and the chapter cycled through men with coffee and cigarette smoke until only the old-timers remained, men who had tattoos like topographical maps of their lives. They sat heavy and watchful, their conversation a low tide of reminiscences and sharper warnings. Knox listened, constellated by the discourses of loyalty and vigilance. Rumors stitched through the talk like old scars. Tales of a rival crew making a play on territory, stories of stolen fuel, intimidating phone calls at odd hours. Knox's fingers tightened around his cup. Vigilance was not paranoia for a man whose life depended on knowing where danger could come from. "You put your name in the ledger?" asked Sal, a councilman whose face read decades of storms. He was the kind of man who measured trust like a ledger. Mara had not been told there was a ledger, but she had seen ink on paper in other places and knew what being recorded could mean. The ledger, in Knox's world, was a list of obligations. Being absent from it was a liability. "No," she admitted, and Knox's hand tightened around the cup to the point his knuckles paled. Sal's gaze slid to Knox like a pair of scales. "If she's working here, she ought to be known," he said. The room hummed. Sal's voice had that weight. "We can't have unknowns." Knox inclined his head. The duty of a president was to maintain the club's perimeter, to make decisions that prevented harm. Knowing this, he also felt a twist in his chest, an urge to protect the enigmatic woman he had watched sweep Chrome into shine. He imagined signing her into a ledger with his name beside it. The visual felt both absurd and inevitable. "Give me a name," Sal said, and it was not an order so much as a demand for accounting. Everyone here had a story that fit into the club's grubby mosaic. Unknowns unsettled the pattern. Mara's mouth went dry. She thought of the city and the way her real last name vibrated like an exposed wire. She thought of the men who might see that name and connect it to the old war, to the dead rival club whose ghost still haunted rumor. To speak would be to invite their old violence back into the room. To stay silent would be to live inside a secret that could explode without warning. Knox felt the cost of secrecy like an iron bar across his sternum. His life was built in plain sight for the most part. Secrets had a way of eroding trust. But there was a deeper, sharper truth. If Mara's name was the one his men had been taught to despise, the ledger would mark her as an enemy by proxy. That made her vulnerable. Knox did not want the ledger to be the instrument of that vulnerability. "She works for Coleman," Knox said, and the name landed like a coin. He gave it the currency of his voice. It wasn't the full truth. It was a way to deflect the ledger's demand without naming what might set the chapter ablaze. Coleman was a man known for hiring help. It was an ordinary thing to say. Sal's face softened in the way a man relaxes when a ledger is balanced. Mara felt the reprieve like a patch pressed over a wound, temporary, necessary. She owed Knox that breath. She also owed herself something she had not named, an ending to the day when she could lock the door and not be catalogued. For now, the compromise held. For now, she could continue sweeping and polishing under Knox's guarded watch. Yet the lie planted a new seed of unease in her chest. Each day she cleaned, she would be present under sworn eyes, and each day the risk that someone knew more would grow. She could continue to be small and careful, or she could claim herself in a life that asked for everything. The club had offered her an unspoken truce, a perimeter, safety in exchange for silence. Knox had drawn that line for her. She could accept it and live within its shelter, or she could refuse and risk the only thing that felt like protection in the city. As the afternoon sun turned the neon sign into a faint halo, Knox walked Mara out to the back door. He had to give her a way home. The street beyond the club was a scrub of gray and wind. He held the door open like a gesture that meant more than the simple courtesy it was. In the doorway, she balanced the mop and a bucket, a small woman who had brought her whole life to the threshold of a new one. Yet the lie planted a new seed of unease in her chest. Each day she cleaned, she would be present under sworn eyes, and each day the risk that someone knew more would grow. She could continue to be small and careful, or she could claim herself in a life that asked for everything. The club had offered her an unspoken truce, a perimeter, safety in exchange for silence. Knox had drawn that line for her. She could accept it and live within its shelter, or she could refuse and risk the only thing that felt like protection in the city. As the afternoon sun turned the neon sign into a faint halo, Knox walked Mara out to the back door. He had to give her a way home. The street beyond the club was a scrub of gray and wind. He held the door open like a gesture that meant more than the simple courtesy it was. In the doorway, she balanced the mop and a bucket, a small woman who had brought her whole life to the threshold of a new one. "You sure you don't want to lift somewhere?" Knox asked. It was a practical question, but carried with it the same danger as any favor in this world. A favor could become an obligation. Mara hesitated, searching his face for a trick. She had been tricked before by men whose smiles had hidden knives. Knox's expression was mostly unreadable, shadowed by the brim of his cap. But his eyes, those old blue-gray things, held a softness she had not expected. She saw then that he had given her an option and left the shape of it uncoerced. It was an offer that did not demand repayment. "No," she said finally. "I've got the bus. I can—" She stopped herself. She did not want to accept charity, not even in the form of a ride. She had been raised to be self-sufficient in a world that prized independence, and the cost of dependence tasted like erasure. Knox closed the door gently and looked at her as if he were weighing a decision he would have to carry through alone. "If you need anything," he started to say, then stopped. Words about needing anything were complicated in his life. They could mean vulnerability or an invitation. "I know," Mara said. Her voice was soft and not shy. It held a kind of wary gratitude. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, Knox reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded paper, money perhaps, or a note, and slid it across the sill. She blinked. The gesture was small, but precious, a shield and an acknowledgement. "Keep it," Knox said, "for the bus." Mara's fingers closed around the paper as if it were fragile. She supposed he could have been testing her, buying information, but instead he had given something honest and practical. He had created a line of safety without asking anything in return. The simplicity of the gesture did something odd in her chest. It chipped away at a calculus she had kept for years, that kindness always cost more than it seemed. As she walked away from the doorway, the club's neon sign humming behind her, the weight of the day settled into her shoulders. Knox watched her go, thinking of risk as if it were a bike he could steer. Protecting her would mean opening a path that others might step into, and the club would demand answers he was not sure he was prepared to give. He had written her into his territory with a single sentence to his men. He had not anticipated the tide that would come with that claim, nor the way the ledger would itch their skin. Mara kept the folded paper like a talisman in her pocket and told herself not to let it make a map in her mind. But as the city swallowed her silhouette and the bus stop lights blinked a tired red, she felt the improbable warmth of being seen by a man like Knox. It was dangerous, and it was delicate, and it turned the simple work of a mop into the first move in a game that neither of them had agreed to play. The choice before her lay like an unlit fuse. Continue under the shelter his presence provided, or risk standing and speaking her name in a room that punished echoes. The first message came on a Tuesday. A picture of a rusted chrome gusset and a single line of text. "We saw her." Knox's phone vibrated like a trapped thing on the table of his office, the neon bleeding through the blinds. He read the message 3 times and felt the blood move in his face like a warning. The sender was a prospect who had too much curiosity and not enough sense. The picture was taken from the roof across the street, a grainy shot of Mara bending in toward the chrome, the light catching the redness of her knuckles. The line beneath it was small and stupid and heavy with consequence. "We got a look." Knox's first motion was not anger at the kid's recklessness, but a cold index to keep the map of risk manageable. Someone had seen her. Someone who noticed strangers in the club's windows had the cautious reflex of a man who measures profit and wound. He set the phone face down without answering and walked out to the lot where the bikes rested like sleeping beasts. He would not go up the ladder of speculation without facts. He had learned that rumors metastasized faster than a bullet wound. Mara kept ringing coins in her pocket like they were prayers. The bus had been late and the city smelled like winter oil. She had decided against walking the last block. She had wanted to put distance between herself and the clubhouse, between the look Knox had given her and the way the men had catalogued her. The folded paper in her pocket warmed like a small illicit ember every time she thought of it. She told herself that she was careful. She told herself she would not name the life in her blood. She told herself she could stay small and disappear again. She was wrong. Rumors layered like dust. In less than 48 hours, a detail someone noticed in a photograph on the pinboard. An earring threaded through a photograph of a man who had died in the old war became a rumor with teeth. A prospect who had family in the scrapyards remembered a name overheard at a dice game, Rios. Another man remembered the angle of Mara's jaw from a dirt track memorial picture. Names were slippery. They found purchase where no one wanted them planted. The club's mouthpiece, always ready to shape gossip into ordinance, began to repeat the question that colored the room. Who is she, really? Knox felt the pulse of it like a threat to his lungs. He had tried to contain it with the small lie that she worked for Coleman, but the lie was a bandage on a bullet hole. Men who lived in the calculus of enemies noticed the slant of a story unfinished. Sal began to ask harder questions, not malevolent at first, but with the insistence of a man who was allergic to unknowns. "If you're protecting her, Knox, we need to know why," he said, as if Knox might offer the council his reasoning like a ledger entry. Knox's answer was a silence that thrummed. He could have told them nothing. That would have been honest and left him alone. But it would have left Mara alone too. And Knox's watch had turned from protecting the club to protecting something inside it that didn't belong. He felt responsibility shift like sand. His oath to the patch now had an unaccounted margin with Mara's name asleep in it. Saying that would be to invite scrutiny. Not saying would be to invite suspicion. The ledger didn't like margins. Sal's patience tightened into threat. He was old enough to remember the cost of being soft on roots, on blood. "We don't harbor old enemies," he said bluntly. "If she has a Rios name, we need to know it so we can decide." Mara found out about the meeting the old way. A hand on her shoulder that wasn't kind, a smell of coffee gone cold, the way the bar's ambience folded into a courtroom. Knox stepped in front of her like a man who had decided to take a bullet for a stranger. He had told Sal she worked for Coleman, but he had not prepared his men for her face in the room. Faces, once set in a place, become facts. Mara watched the men file in like a procession of judge and jury, the patch glinting in the dim. Her chest shrank. Grief had taught her to wait for the worst and keep counting the breaths. "Why are you here?" asked Sal before anyone had properly sat. The room's silence had the sharpness of metal. Knox said slowly, "She cleans. She keeps hours. End of it." "That's no answer," snapped another man, and a chorus of his sort rose like a tide. Mara could have stood then and said her name. She could have plastered it across the table and let the club weigh it, let the consequences fall where they would. Instead, she watched Knox's hands, square, thick, a map of decisions and abandoned tenderness. He claimed her with his voice and the roughness of his shadow. He reiterated the Coleman story, and each time a man repeated it, the lie made itself part of the club's weather. Sal wasn't satisfied. He reached into the ledger drawer and lifted a bundle of brittle paper. Old incident reports, names of men who had been fought and lost. He flicked through and landed on a photocopy of a faded newspaper clipping. If this is the woman, then our choices are clear. The clipping had a younger man in a scuffle, his badge marked with Rios, as if destiny had printed itself into his skin. There was a kind of silence that signaled a fracture. Mara felt the floor drop, like a trolley rail that ends in air. Knox's mouth pinched, as if something inside him tried to form a command that could save both his club and the woman who had drifted into its orbit. The rules of his life did not account for saving someone who might be at the heart of a story that required their rage. He was an architect of boundaries, a man who kept people on the roads where they belonged. Yet as the men argued, as words became coordinates and coordinates became accusations, Knox found himself listening to Mara's breath, not the ledger's arithmetic. "You'd put her on probation?" Sal asked, eyes hard. "Put her under watch? Make sure she ain't bringing trouble in with her?" Knox fought for something that was neither cowardice nor shedding of duty. "We keep her hours. We let her do her work. We do not make her perish," he said. The statement landed neither as edict nor as apology. It was a middle ground, a ridge between a valley of hate and a trough of loyalty that demanded newcomers. The men grumbled, but accepted that a line had been drawn, one they trusted because it came from Knox. But the line wouldn't hold where secrets were concerned. Someone leaked a photograph to a rival patch, the kind of thing done by men who believed in old tribes' justice. An anonymous camera found Mara on a bus, the folded paper protruding from her pocket like a map. The rival crew's paper, circulated fast and mean, labeled the cleaner as the last of the Rios, an inheritance of hatred that didn't require her consent. Trader's daughter spotted taking refuge in enemy den. When the paper hit the clubhouse, it was like a grenade with its pin pulled. Men read the words and set them like tinder to ancient fuel. Knox watched the mood change with the unclenched horror of a man who had both created and been trapped by the system he served. "We were wrong," Sal said, not ashamed, but as if he had been given a simple operation to perform. "We can't have her here." Knox felt the world narrow into two impossible choices: to follow the club's demand and deliver a woman into the jaws of vengeance, or to defy the very code that defined him and risk the club's cohesion. He had built his life on hard edges. Now they cut into him. He thought of the bread of his childhood, of the nights he had learned to make decisions by which man lived and which man died. He had always believed the club's will was the arc he must bend to. He had not realized how much of his marrow had been shaped by the idea of loyalty until it asked him to betray his own tenderness. Mara felt the room tilt. Men who had nodded at her earlier now processed her as a dossier. A prospect shoved his chair back too hard and laughed the laugh of a man relieving his guilt with noise. Sweat beaded at Knox's temple as if his body knew a heat his mind could not yet name. He stood then and spoke in a voice that tried to stop the train of judgment. "She earned her hours," he said. "She ain't a threat." "Your call, Knox," Sal said. "But if she's connected to the Rios, then keeping her is putting all of us at risk. You either sign her in or you hand her out." The room's ultimatum was a fracture with a blade. Knox's chest hurt like a trapped animal. He imagined the ledger again, imagined writing his name under hers and seeing how the ink would smear. To sign her in would be to accept her into their ledger and hope the past didn't demand its toll. To hand her out, eliminate her presence, could mean delivering a woman to blood that had once poured in the street. The calculus was brutal. "You want me to make a decision I can't undo in a room full of men who will not see the cost?" Knox asked, the question not for them, but for himself. They would make their decision either way. He would have to live with it. He looked at Mara then, and for a breath he saw not the possible seed of enemy, but the tremor of a woman who had cleaned chrome as if it might save her. He saw the small dignity of someone whose grief had taught her to move carefully in rooms of men who owned storms. The council suspended their judgment for a moment, which in itself was its own kind of violence. Sal left the ledger closed, like a book with a promise to revisit it. They would let the facts strut and simmer. They would ask questions, prowl for confirmation. But outside, other teeth bared. Rivals smelled blood. Knox knew that the leak had already traveled beyond the clubhouse's walls. The rival patch would test their nerve, and the club would be obliged to respond if the threat was proven. Knox realized, in the hollow after the council's exodus, that secrecy had become a fracture new and dangerous. He had tried to protect by concealment, by small lies. Instead, he had created a pressure vessel. The men left, the clubhouse emptying, and taking with them a chorus of unsettled loyalties. Mara stayed, still clutching her mop as if it were a spear. Her face was thinner somehow, like a map wiped and relined. "Why didn't you tell them?" she asked finally, voice like a thread. It wasn't an accusation so much as a question about the trust one life could place in another. Knox sat down on the edge of a table and looked at her. His fingers curled into their own old decisions. "Because I thought I could keep you safe," he said, and the confession carried the weight of everything he had not allowed himself to admit. "Because I thought it would be easier to manage than to tell the truth." Mara stared at him as if he had been a stranger, speaking in a language her body recognized but could not translate. "You lied for me," she said. The words were at once gratitude and something rougher, like a tax of shame. "You lied to the club." He nodded. "I did." The admission changed the architecture between them. Secrets had been kept, and now two stood before each other with the knowledge that the concealment had already damaged the safety it was meant to buy. The fracture was no longer just among the men. It ran between them, a crack that invited either collapse or a new kind of truth. Outside, engines started up like distant thunder. The world beyond the clubhouse had not paused for their private considerations. A leak had made itself a fable. Choices had to be made. In the shadowed hum of the room, Mara felt the finite size of the protection Knox offered and the impossible scale of the thing she was, a woman with a name that could set fires. The club had asked for names. The city would demand proof. Knox had promised shelter in a ledger of lies, and that shelter began to crumble at the edges. She tightened her grip on the mop and looked at him as a man who had bent the rules for her, a man who had put his patch on the line. "If they decide to hand me over," she said, "will you stand with me or let them do what they think is right?" Knox took a long breath, and in it was the sound of a man picking up the weight that would change the contours of his life. The answer would not be easy. It would cost him more than he had the language for. But he had already slipped a paper into her pocket, had already told a lie for a woman he had only just begun to know. The ledger would want its pound of flesh. His heart, a place he had kept guarded from the club's demands, had started to beat a different allegiance. "I won't hand you over," he said finally. And in the hush that followed, those words sounded like a verdict, a beginning of fracture that might either cleave or bind. He didn't pretend he knew how they would survive what came next. He only knew that he would not be the man who turned a woman into a ledger entry when the ledger asked for her blood. The meeting's verdict had not yet been spoken when the sound of engines cut through the clubhouse like a detonator. Men cursed and grabbed jackets. Someone shouted that a tail was outside. Knox's jaw clenched because the world beyond their patched circle had its own rules, and those rules often arrived with guns or brass knuckles. He saw the way faces in the room hardened. Danger had a smell they all recognized. Mara's hands tightened on the mop handle until the wood creaked. She looked like someone ready to throw herself between a child and a violence she could not control. "Get out back," Knox ordered, voice becoming the blade he used to part storms. He didn't leave room for argument. He moved as if the movement could rewrite consequence. Toward the door, toward the lot, toward the line where loyalty would be tested. Men spilled out behind him, leaving the clubhouse hollow and echoing with their boots. Mara stood in the emptiness and felt the absence of their company as a physical thing. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt a hot, fierce clarity, fear braided with a strange, rising courage. Outside, under a sky the color of broken glass, two bikes idled like predators. A black sedan hunched at the curb, its windows dark as the eyes of something that had waited. Men stepped from it with the casual efficiency of those who believed in taking what belonged to them. At their head was a man Mara recognized from old papers. Newer hair, but the same jaw as the clipping in the ledger. He had the arrogance of a man who believed history would bend to his will. "You've got something of ours," he said, voice flat as an unpaid debt. His men spread, a horseshoe of intent. Knox stepped forward, patch flashing in the light like a challenge. "She's with us," he said, and the words landed with the weight of claim. The man at the curb smiled like a man who reads the world in scores. "You hold a Rios," he returned. "We hold debts." Knox's hand moved toward his hip because that was where the map of his life lived, the soft readiness to hurt to prevent worse. Mara felt the movement, and something in it snapped with it. She could not be moved as an object between packs. She stepped forward, surprising even herself. "I'm not a debt," she said, voice steadier than she felt. The man laughed, a sound like dry leaves. "You clean in their den. That makes you a bargaining chip." The argument ended with a bullet's kiss to metal as a prospect misread a space. Men dove, bikes revved, and suddenly the asphalt was a hymn of motion. Knox's shirt blossomed dark at the shoulder, and he didn't flinch. He pivoted with the economy of a man who'd worn danger like a second skin. He moved to put himself between Mara and the wrath that had come for her. Sal's lean body took a round to the ribs as he put his weight against a rival, cursing as if pain were an old friend. Chaos burned hot and quick. Words were buried under the crack of gunfire and the smell of dust and oil. Mara found herself reacting on a fury she had not known she could own. She dropped the mop from her mind like an old prayer and grabbed a length of chain from a nearby toolbox, swinging it with a desperation that felt holy. She was not afraid of blood anymore. Grief had already taught her that the thing you loved most could be taken, and the only language left was defense. She struck, clanging steel against metal and bone, and the sound registered as an alarm. A prospect shoved a steward into a bike, scrambling colors into the lift of the fight. Mara hit again, her arm burning, and the men nearest her faltered because the image of a cleaner fighting was not in their ledger. Nox fought with a precision that was almost tender. He guided threats away from Mara as if he could shepherd shard glass into harmless piles. He took hits that he hid behind the meaning of chapter duty, bruises to the body that he translated as tax for the life he had chosen. When he saw Mara take a blow meant for him, the world narrowed. He had always believed sacrifice was currency paid out when needed. He had never imagined the cost would ask him to give more than his ribs. He shoved a man away and felt the sting of a knife nick across his palm. The cut was shallow, but the fact of it settled in a place inside him that cataloged proof of what he would now risk. They drove the rival back enough to gather themselves, breath knocking like horses in a stall. Nox leaned close to Mara, blood smeared across his jaw like an accusation and a benediction. His breath smelled of smoke and iron and something warmer, terrified relief. "You should have stayed inside," he said, voice raw. The fury in him was not just for the fight, but for the truth that she had stood with him. She touched his hand where the cut had bled. Her fingers were small against his scarred knuckles. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I didn't ask." He closed his fingers over hers, not as a command, but as a covenant. The crowd around them muttered and licked wounds and measured losses. The rival's leader had retreated with a sneer that promised more, a promise Nox cataloged as threat rather than challenge. Sal limped over, folding a cloth to bind his side, and said the thing that had been held like a blade. This was folly. It was protection, Nox answered, and his eyes were a map of choices he'd already made. He looked at Mara like a man who had arranged an altar where none existed. You stood, so I stood. The minutes that followed were an odd clearing. Men took stock of bruises and fuel, of the ledger and the night's contagion. Mara sat on the lip of Nox's bike, the world tilting and settling beneath her. She had dirt in her hair and a cut on her palm that matched his. For a breath, the chaos receded, and the two of them were small and simple as two bodies that had chosen to keep each other from harm. "You could have left," Nox said finally, not reproach, but an outline of grief. "You could have gone." "So could you," Mara replied, "but you didn't." He swallowed, the expression folding his face like a map. "I made a choice I can't take back," he said. "I signed my name by protecting you." His voice was quieter now, as if the world had thinned to the two of them and the decisions he'd made. "And if they come tomorrow, if this doesn't stop, I'll stand again." She looked at him, at the honest way his chest still rose and fell, at the smear of his blood on her palm. She felt the weight of what he'd just chosen, the physics of loyalty in a world that was never kind. The thought of Nox risking his club for her was almost obscene in its tenderness. She wanted to tell him he had not owed her anything, but the truth she couldn't hide was that she had wanted him to. "I don't want your sacrifice," she said. "I want, whatever this is, to be ours and not a ledger entry." Nox's laugh was short, surprised. "I don't know how to give you anything but my patch and my teeth," he said. "But I know this, I'll choose you over a ledger if that's what it takes." They sealed the vow in a kiss neither planned, brief, fierce, an agreement written in the mouth and the burned air between them. Around them, men repaired engines and patched flesh. The world would ask for more. Tonight, they'd bought time. Nox dusted his palms on his jeans and stood, the leader who had chosen an impossible loyalty. Mara kissed the corner of his mouth, as if she were affirming the risk. When the rival's car was a shadow down the block and the clubhouse's neon hummed its tired hymn, Knox took Mara's hand in the way a man holds a promise. "We plan," he said. "We make it hard for them to take you. We make the ledger irrelevant." She let the plan sit like a warmth between them. The night had thrown flames at them, and they'd answered with a courage born of private grief and sudden fierce care. Knox had chosen, sacrificed into history the distance he'd kept, and Mara had answered in the same currency. In the hush after the engines cooled, their hands clasped and the future loomed, dangerous, uncertain, and suddenly heartbreakingly theirs. They stayed on the lot until dawn washed the patched jackets in gray light. Men moved like wounded weather around them, engines cooled, conversations shortened into plans. Knox spoke in the language of tactics, routes, safe houses, names to trust, and Mara listened, learning the contours of a world she had only ever cleaned. They formed details into defenses that were practical and personal. A burner phone, a stash at a cousin's trailer, a cover story tied to Coleman that would be thicker this time. When silence finally let them think, Knox rode Mara to the edge of the neighborhood, slower than the road demanded, as if every turn bought them a little more of each other. She kept her hands inside his jacket, where the patch lay like a promise. He told her, without the club's ritual words, what he had not allowed himself to name, that she did not have to be ashamed of the blood she carried, only careful with how she used it. She told him the truth she'd kept like a coin, that the Rio's name had been survival and not a weapon until it became a saint on somebody else's altar. They agreed on nothing grand, only on the small and necessary: how to move when they needed to, who would answer for what, which allies still owed favors. There was grieving to do, and anger to temper, and the ledger would scuff them for a while. But more urgently, there was each other, an awkward, fragile partnership forged in the immediacy of violence, and the steadiness of two people who chose one another for reasons that were not tidy. Weeks passed that wore like leather. The club tightened its perimeter without severing hers. Sal watched Knox closely and measured grudging respect in the way he allocated rides and shifts, a slow truce settling like dust. Rivals tested edges and were met with calculated resistance rather than spectacle. Mara learned to ride. The first time she steadied on a highway, wind like prayer taking her hair, Knox's grin was a rare, soft thing that changed the way she breathed. At night, they sat on the clubhouse roof and named stars that had no names for them, mapping a future in the space above a life that demanded hard choices. They were not naive. The city still hummed with old loyalties, but they had carved a margin where tenderness might grow.